We've had a technical hitch called Sydney Airport, and I'll come back to that after my introductions. As usual, we'll have a Q&A after we've heard from our guest speaker. We'll just be doing Q&A via the app, so make sure you choose Arena 2 when we get to the Q&A. So choosing a topic and a speaker for the last session at CMSF is always a challenge. It needs to be something different and interesting to keep you here. We thought about the Dalai Lama on ethical values in Australian banks. His response was he thought he'd give world peace another shot first. We thought maybe Kim Jong-un on investment opportunities in North Korea, but that would only take 5 minutes, and how many of them can afford to buy bomb shelters anyway? I understand he only travels by train, and IFM is still working on the PPP proposal for the railway line from North Queensland to Singapore via Bali, but it will still be finished before the Sydney Light Rail. So then one day I found this bloke rummaging in the bins out the back of our Melbourne office. And for those of you who know where our Melbourne office is, it's in Spring Street in the theatre district. So I thought, well, must be an unemployed actor. So I went up and signed him up to the fund straight away, of course. And then he gave me this cockamamie story about how he was doing a pilot for a TV series about garbage, and he was going to pitch it to the ABC. And I thought, those pinko greenies down there, they'd just about buy that. And they did. Now, in introducing our speaker, I should point out that in my first offer to him, I offered him petrol money and a cheese sandwich to get here to present, but he got all fancy on us and decided to catch an aeroplane, and that's why he's not here in person. But he is going to be here, I think, thanks to the techs up the back. So please let me introduce to you our speaker, a man who's paid to talk rubbish, and he's very good at it. Please welcome the Major General of the War and Waste, Craig Reucassel.
Hello. Can you hear me, ladies and gentlemen?
Yes.
Yeah, it sounds. Oh, that's good. So thank you, Graeme, for that introduction. Look, normally I would say it's good to be there. In this case, I think it sounds rude if I say it's good to not be there. But it's good that we're actually talking here. It's good that we're actually, despite spending hours at Sydney Airport last night and lightning ruling out my ability to get there, I'm glad that the AIC has gone on this experiment and been happy to do this experiment of talking here, because I must admit, every time I fly somewhere to speak, I do feel, particularly about the environment, I feel quite guilty. I'm always getting carbon offsets, but I do feel guilty about it. In Sweden, when I was there, they told me about it, and they have, there's a word there, which is basically flight guilt. It's guilt about flying. And in Australia, we don't really have that. Sydney to Melbourne is the second most travelled route in the world. So, maybe this experiment could work. I mean, Graeme seems immediately sceptical, and it certainly feels less nice to be there with you. It's a lot harder to get drunk with you as well through this teleconferencing method. But nonetheless, I'm here and we will be able to talk briefly. I do like the fact, actually, it's one of the things I liked about CMSF, is that when I said to them, look, I'd love to come up, but I do need my flight to be, carbon offset. They said, look, that's our policy already. That's already what our policy is. That's what we do anyway. They also then said, they've got some great policies, actually. They said, we don't want lots of graphs in PowerPoint. And that's a shame, because I have some great graphs, but because there's no PowerPoint rule, I will have to act them out today and just show you what those graphs are. The other thing is, the other similar policy is most people in that room, pretty much everyone in the room, has a policy of not charging dead people. I also have that policy. So it's great that we're all simpatico on this same front here. I was slightly concerned, I've got to say, that this event was being held on the Gold Coast. When I think of the Gold Coast, I don't necessarily think of responsible management of money. But nonetheless, I guess in many ways it's good, because if you are misspending in any way, every single retiree is there around you at the time to catch you out. So, look, it's great to be here. I'm going to talk a little bit of waste stuff today. I'm going to talk a little bit about a couple of areas of waste. And look, we'll try not to keep too dry, but I get passionate when we talk about this, and it's an environmental thing. I'm also going to talk. I'm not going to talk about the waste in your particular office. There's always I've recognised now that there's always a great waste worry in every office who pulls people in line, but in the Australian context, it's a bigger problem, and it's an area where hopefully funds such as yourselves will be investing, because there's a lot of opportunity there. There's a lot of things that are changing at the moment and a lot of things that need to change. Currently, we have pretty much zero federal leadership on this, but hopefully that might change at some point as well. So let me start with food waste. And food waste, obviously, we've all got a kind of visceral response about food waste. Food, and we feel guilty about that. And it's not just about the fact that one of the things about food waste is, of course, we're throwing out all the energy and the water and the effort and labour that went into actually creating the food in the first place. But it has a massive multiplier effect. And I want to talk briefly about climate change. And I feel confident doing this because it's interesting. Even Tony Abbott is now on board with the Paris Agreement. It's amazing how when you come closer to an election and the public voting, and further away from the times when you're getting donations from minerals companies. It's interesting how your perspective on these things can change. So I feel that this close to the election, and as I stand in my child's bedroom while they march against climate change, I feel we can confidently look at this in a climate change perspective. And that is that a couple of years ago, we threw out 5 million tonnes of food. And because when you throw out food and you put it in landfill, it basically turns into methane, which is carbon is 25 times worse than carbon dioxide. That 5 million tonnes of food that we threw out turned into 7 million tonnes of CO2 equivalent. It's a ridiculous approach to actually throw out our food and put it into landfill is nuts. And it's interesting, one of the councils down in Melbourne, Plenary Council, they did a study on their actual carbon footprint of the council, and 79% of their carbon footprint merely came from the fact that they buried the food that they picked up. 79%, and they're trying to get rid of that now. And it's interesting, there are some changes happening here. The CEFC has actually given a loan to a company down in Melbourne to actually build a place to ensure that we take our food waste from the side of the road and we actually go and basically turn it into compost. And that's being done around the country as well. So it's a thing that's changing, but it's fascinating how slow it changes. And it's really interesting to see different things that can stop it. I think you would probably understand policy stuff better than most people. But a great example of this is that Adelaide, for many years, get ahead of the pack, had bins at the side, put your food and recycle it. And yet every time I go there, most people weren't using it. And the reason was, when they brought in the rule, one of the local shock jocks had a lot of medical waste. And when they said, we're going to move your waste bin to being every 2 weeks and your food and your garden bin will be every week, he lost it. And so the government backed down and put in legislation that the red bin had to be picked up every week. And this means that most people don't put their food into the green bin, even though they can, because it gets smelly after 2 weeks. So it's amazing the little things that can get in the way. But it is an area where hopefully there's now investment, there's now a recognition from people like the CFC that this is what has to happen. Australia should not have any food going into landfill. Now, that is an area, and it's a kind of an uncontroversial area. And there's 7 million tonnes of CO2 is not the biggest part of our carbon footprint, although it's a fairly uncontroversial part. It's not going to go against some of the major players. So you would think it was an uncontroversial, simple way for the government to get that kind of change. And hopefully something will happen on that front. Hopefully there'll be more investment in that. I want to leave food briefly. I needed to set up that idea of what's going to happen as you compost on the side of the road, your food, your green waste, because I want to talk about packaging. And this is the big area where changes are happening and where massive investments are going into. And what happens here is going to really define where we go in terms of our going forward. We've become enormously passionate and worried about plastic waste. I mean, people all over Australia now kind of know the stats. 8 million tonnes of plastic goes into the ocean each year around the world. And we've seen reports of it not only getting to the gullets of birds getting to fish, and it's now gotten into our food chain. We've seen stories recently about we have plastic inside of us. It's something that people it's become ubiquitous. It's become part of our country so much so. It's only been over 60 years. We've used 6.3 million tonnes of it, and now it's actually become part of our food. So there's a worry about it. So the thing is, how do we solve this problem? And what do we do about it? Well, let's have a look at what's in Australia briefly. So Australia has come up with a policy. By 2025, 100% of our packaging will be recyclable, compostable, or reusable. Sounds great when you initially heard it. That until I thought about it for a bit. You go, oh, 100% recyclable, compostable. At the moment, an enormous amount of our plastic is recycled. The problem is it doesn't get recycled. APCO, the Australian Packaging Covenant, did a study recently and showed basically their figures showed 30%, things like PET and HDPE are actually recycled. Very low rates. And most studies I'd seen that will have 10 to 20%. So the fact that something is recyclable or compostable doesn't mean it is being recycled. So perhaps in response to this, they've come up with a new target, which is that 70% of plastic packaging will be recycled or compostable by 2025, and that 30% on average packaging will be. The big question is what's happening about this? This is under the ratings of our environmental problems. Endangered species. So it's kind of like if you see Melissa Prentice, it's like seeing a tiger. You get a photo of it, tell your kids you saw the environment there. It's quite a rare thing. I have seen her once or twice on Sky News, and it was amazing to see. The concern is anything actually going to be done about this? Because it hasn't been legislated. There's no real clear way it's going to happen. So this is my favourite. It's my favourite crop there in Queensland. Queensland has one of the worst attitudes to waste. So it's changing. They did an assessment of their own waste there. This was the conclusion. It's very bureaucratic language, but you may understand it. It said, the heavy reliance on voluntary action plans, which did not eventuate, impeded the strategy's success. If I could translate that out of bureaucracy, what it means is we made it voluntary, and nobody did it, so nothing actually happened. And that tends to be the approach with most of these policies in Australia. It's entirely voluntary. Will anybody do it? That's the fundamental question. So some people are doing something else. So let's look at it though, because the interesting thing about this, and this is the interesting thing from an investment perspective, from a perspective of what's going to happen, is these are two totally different systems, recycling and composting. 70% of things will be recycled or composted when 2025. Totally different systems, and if you don't get it right, it doesn't work. So I'll give you an example. There's a convention centre down in Melbourne that is trying to go really green. So they've gone and got all the plastic cups and they've got them made out of bioplastics. No, they're not made of fuel. They're made out of cornstarch and stuff like that. So they've got them sitting there next to their water bottles, and next to that they have a recycling bin. Now, the interesting thing about this is that if you take your bio cup, use it and put it in a recycling bin, you have just created 100% contamination. You can't recycle bio cups. You've got to compost them. And yet there's no composting in Australia. So I've seen this, and lots of companies are doing this. They're going, hey, we're going to get the new environmentally friendly, we're going to get bio cups or compostable things, and then they don't know where to put it. It actually has to be a system that they actually deal with it. And there's a huge increase in people buying this kind of stuff. There's no waste stream. Now, that's not to say it can't work. So currently, I talked about the fact that, councils are moving to taking compostable materials, taking your green waste and your food waste and composting it. This suggests to you, okay, here's what I can do. I can put it into my green bin and it will be composted. Right? The unfortunate thing is most of the eastern coast places that are doing this, whenever I talk to them and say, okay, this means you can take compostable packaging, they go, no, we don't want it. We don't trust people to put the right thing in there. So to me, it suddenly goes, oh no, we have this possible way to solve this problem, and yet We can't actually do it. That said, thankfully we have South Australia. South Australia is this weird blip of a place. They use renewable energy down there. They do a lot of strange things there. Not all of them are legal. But the great thing is they've got two big composting companies who have been working in this for years, and they accept composting packaging. So if you go to something like Womadelaide out there, what they'll do is they'll make sure that every place there uses composting packaging, they'll clear it, and then so it can be done, which doesn't necessarily happen. So that's the composting side. To invest in that, if people are going to say this is the solution of plastic waste, all that kind of stuff, and sure, it's actually a waste to deal with it. So where you are right now, when they brought in that plastic bag ban, they banned compostable bags as well. So they said, look, if it gets to the water, if the turtle chokes on it, it doesn't make any difference to the turtle, whether it's made of petrol or stuff. It's the same, it has the same thing. So it's an interesting thing. So the other alternative stream is recycling, and as we all know, recycling has an interesting thing recently with China, kind of pulling a lot of the recycling. And this has really changed what has been going on in this area.
Okay.
So,
Craig, I'm just going to interrupt you for a moment because you're coming through in bursts. So what we're going to do is just cut you off and call you back, and we'll just do audio, which is, a relief for most of us here anyway, if we just do the audio.
Yeah, you're sick of seeing me. Is this what it is? Yeah.
So just hang up and we'll call you back.
Okay, it looks like this experiment, it looks like I'm going to be flying forever.
So get those questions coming, because I've only got two so far. We'll see how this technical stuff goes. But I said to the techos, because you can see that I'm an IT expert before, just, have you turned it off and turned it back on again, sir, from the IT crowd? And that's what we're going to do.
Hello, Graeme.
Yes, Craig.
Can you hear me?
We can. Keep going.
There you go.
Much better.
Look, I do apologise for this, guys. It's such a shame because obviously I'd prefer to be in the room with you, and I would also prefer to be proving that we could teleconference and didn't have to fly around the country to see each other. I feel like I'm at the forefront here of proving the opposite, and plane usage will go up. So probably invest in stocks in Qantas and Virgin after this happens. But just to go back to, talk about recycling. What's happening with recycling? And the whole model of recycling changed when China kind of rejected our stuff. What we used to do is we just chuck it all together in a big cube of all the different plastics, and we were paid by companies like SKM to send it over to China, and they would accept it. And when they said no to that, it totally changed what was happening there. Suddenly the things that we got paid for, you got nothing for, which is not to say there isn't still a market there. If you get pure HDPE, you can get $500 a tonne for it, $300 a tonne if it's coloured. You can still sell this stuff, but it's a very different model. And unfortunately, all of our materials recovery facilities were built to the old model. The interesting thing as well is the question I generally get asked by people is, where is it going now? Now, the first thing I think is it's going to landfill, and it definitely has increased. So this is leading to an erosion of our faith in recycling. But the second thing is people presume that we're dealing with it in Australia now, and that is totally and utterly wrong. Since China pulled out of our recycling and reduced taking our recycling, we now send more of our recycling and plastic recycling overseas. We send it to Malaysia, we send it predominantly to Indonesia. We did send to Vietnam for a while, but they started closing down. So in all these cases, what we're seeing is a total change in the way we deal with that. Now, there's a bit of a problem here, and there's a massive risk involved with this for the people who are actually recycling out there. And that risk is, firstly, as we've seen from countries like India and Vietnam, they suddenly say, look, we don't want your stuff, we don't recycle anymore. But the other risk is a big one about reputation. So, for instance, Unearthed, which is an investigative arm of Greenpeace, followed the waste from the UK councils to Malaysia and filmed what was happening with it. And in many cases, it was flying around in the streets, it was being burnt, it was being treated, wasn't being treated properly. And that's the kind of thing that, hypothetically speaking, if there was a waste-based show in Australia where they use GPSs and could track waste and go to Malaysia, it would probably turn up very similar results and would show, and again, undermine people's faith in recycling. So again, the interesting thing about this is we've had a few years of everybody knowing about China pulling out. We've had a few years, we've got lots of money sitting in particularly waste levies in New South Wales and Victoria, and yet very little has been done to actually overcome this problem and to say we need to increase the recycling back home, we need to increase the processing back here. And I'm not opposed to it going overseas, but you've got to have the proper system. And again, South Australia is kind of the one place where you go, oh, maybe they're showing the way. There's a new private recycling plastics company in South Australia. It's going to take mixed plastic, the stuff that no one wants. It's going to take 25,000, 40,000 tonnes of it at Recycling Plastics Australia. And it looks like South Australia will be able to deal with all of its recycling in the one place and actually deal with it in our home market. So that's the kind of thing, hopefully that can change. Now, one of the reasons you want to get all of this right is that where the real money is going and where the real solution is happening, where you look behind the scenes, is it's going to waste to energy. It's going to massive plants being built in Queensland, in Perth, Melbourne, that are going to burn waste. Now, it's not necessarily terrible to burn waste, but it has to be only the bits you can't recycle. At the moment, we have an entire recycling system that's falling apart, then we're not actually going to be able to deal with it. What actually happens is you end up with plastic going into the furnaces. That creates CO2, and it's a massively inefficient way to deal with it. So that is the problem we're facing at the moment. It's easier to invest big money, waste energy, and that means it makes it easy for councils to go, okay, we don't have to deal with recycling or because the down the road, I love it. It's like crazy. It creates lots of electricity, but it actually doesn't have a positive environmental footprint. The good thing in Australia's case is that because generally our energy footprint is so terrible, it's not quite as bad as it could be, but it's definitely a step towards that case. And look, I'll go to questions soon because I think it's better if we're interacting up. But just quickly before I get to that, the interesting, there's another development. The one thing we don't ever talk about, we talk about recycling, we talk about composting, but the other part about that goal is things to be reusable. And that's the hard thing. People either reducing in the first place or using. There's an interesting company, TerraCycle, is testing something in America and Europe called Loop, which is where you get all of your groceries delivered to you in reusable containers that will then be picked up the next week. And it creates a cycle where you don't have throwaway packaging. Now, obviously, I haven't done a life cycle assessment on this yet, so you've got to prove that, driving these reusable containers to the house each week and taking them, cleaning them is actually a step forward. It obviously means less litter, less likely for fish to choke on it, but is it going to actually solve that problem? But it's interesting that they're actually looking at that and trying to actually create some kind of reusable loop so that we don't have to rely so much on throwaway containers. And the interesting, the first step though, and the hardest step is reduce. And, people started using reusable cups after the war on waste, but it's still only the people that cared about it. The bigger question is how do you change the habits of people that really care? And the only area I think we've actually done in Australia is actually probably in plastic bags. And we saw recently when Seaberg finally in South Australia, only 9 years later, and put in a 15-cent fee for plastic bags, we saw the East Coast of Australia slightly lose their shit. We saw an article in newspapers saying, it's a huge right to get free plastic bags every shop. And people said it was going to fall apart, despite the fact that I showed constantly. South Australians had not starved to death the last 9 years, just having this effect. Once that panic, what we saw is that little price mechanism there, a little 15%, has now led to an 80% drop in the use of plastic bags. So that's what we need to do broadly, is how do we get a system where we have those price implications, have those little things that make people change their habits and move to reduce their waste footprint. Because at the moment, when it comes to the back end, the kind of recycling and those other things, there are problems. We are recycling at best 30% of our plastics. So we need to reduce it substantially. We need to make sure we put in place systems and hopefully you guys got all the money, you can invest in these things. Hopefully we'll see a reduction in our waste, but also a massive reduction in our kind of carbon footprint from our waste. So look, I'm going to go to questions now because I know you're probably sick to death of hearing this echoey voice come through from the screen there. So Graeme, throw me the questions. First question, do I think teleconferencing is the way of the future? Is that the question?
No. We will persevere. You're a bit jumpy, but then you probably always have been.
Yeah, exactly.
So, you touched on something that I'm going to kick off with a question first because I've got control of the microphone, Craig. So, I don't know if you saw the article in the newspapers. We still have newspapers, I'm pleased to report, about the small business in Melbourne called the Roving Refills. Two sisters who cart a truck around to Melbourne markets, and you can front up, bring your own container, and they'll fill it up with shampoo and soaps and detergents and vinegar and, for some reason, borax. I don't know how that got on the list. But it got me thinking about when I was growing up back in 1828, our groceries, there was nothing in plastic. Like there wasn't. The soap powder came in cardboard boxes, a renewable resource called timber. Just had to get that in as ex-First Super CEO. And in fact, a lot of stuff came in cardboard boxes, a renewable resource. I tried to think of when I was a kid what came in plastic. And I don't think even the ice cream came in plastic. Well, we probably didn't have ice cream, we were so poor. But so I'm just wondering, shouldn't we be thinking about going back to the source, which is what is the original packaging anyway? Is there over-packaging? And also, I've got to say, things like food handling regulations, has that all gone a bit silly too?
Absolutely. Look, it's complex because these kind of reuse things where they do come out and fill up your stuff, and lots of people now take, their own package, they take their own reusable glass things into stores and they sometimes refill. But again, there's a problem is that I think that's probably going to only get maybe 5 to 10% of people who are really passionate about it. And I come back to that problem of how do we change the behaviour of those that don't care about it much. Now, it's interesting because you talk about the fact that we didn't have plastic. And one of the things that was often said to me when you talk about getting rid of plastic bags is people would say, why don't we just go back to paper bags? That's what we used to have. Why don't we just do that? Now, this is one of the things where it becomes complex and where you've got to really make sure that when you're looking at solutions, you look at the whole life cycle of a product. Because paper bags, while they're far better in the sense that they're not going to choke a fish or a dolphin or something, and if they get into water, they'll break down. So on a litter front, they're far better. But they have a bigger footprint as a carbon footprint. They have to use a lot more water and a lot more resources overall, electricity. So if you were going to go and take, Woolworths admitted they were giving out 3 billion free plastic bags. If you were going to say, okay, we'll switch that to just giving out free paper bags, you would actually have a bigger environmental footprint, which is why the approach, despite the fact that it doesn't solve the problem overall, why the approach of charging for it, changing people's behaviours to reusable things, and therefore reducing the use overall is actually a better approach. So yeah, definitely. We should be, cardboard is a lot better. It's a much more sustainable thing in many ways, and it's very recyclable. But you've got to be careful to look at the overall footprint of these things. And that's why anything that moves to reuse rather than single use is the way we've got to be going.
So questions from the audience, Craig, quickly. First one, how can the superannuation industry help? Where should we be investing, lobbying, encouraging, acting?
Yeah, well, as I said, I think if you're investing somewhere, if you're investing in, and as I said, there's now money, there's now investment from the CEFC. If you're investing in the infrastructure to take food out of landfill, and there's another double bonus to this, in that we've got really bad soil profiles in Australia, and this leads to more compost, which leads to better soil, leads to kind of holding carbon in soil, it keeps water in the soil. It's so many benefits come from this. So that's an area where I think there needs to be this investment. And I guess it's investing in the possible solutions. It's keeping an eye out for these, solutions to the problems of waste. And asking the right questions, though. You've got to ask for life cycle assessments. You've got to ask for the overall impact of these things and look at it from a full environmental attitude. I know there's an interesting example we used in the War on Waste where a company called Reucassel, they're looking at taking the really low-value plastic and turning it back into oil, which can be used as aviation gas or different types of oil. And you kind of go, okay, that's interesting. There'll be some plastic that's too rubbish to recycle, and this is another route. But every time I kind of ask and go, okay, we want to see the overall environmental footprint of this, you still haven't quite got there. So you got to be careful. But there's a lot of people trying to find solutions to these things, and investing in those is, if you hit the one that is a breakthrough, there's a massive market out there of people who really, really want to avoid waste and really want to find solutions to it. So there's an economic reason as well as an environmental reason to invest in this space.
So one of the solutions, inverted commas perhaps, that's bobbing up around the country, including up here in Ipswich, is incinerators. I think you touched on that before in the bits that we maybe weren't hearing. So what's your view on incinerators?
My view on incinerators is that that's where all the money is going. And unfortunately, if you do not fix recycling first, it means that massive amounts of plastic are going to be burnt, and that creates massive CO2.
Can you rerun that? We got jumpy bits there again.
Sorry. Goddamn internet, I'm even plugged in. What we need in this country is an NBN.
Yeah, no, it's coming after the Sydney Light Rail.
Yeah, so the problem with waste to energy is that even when I visited Sweden and looked at the system there, and they have better recycling systems than us, but still 80% of plastic was being burnt, and that has a massive CO2 footprint. So if you're burning plastic to make energy, it's not necessarily the most efficient way of doing it. So if you can get the plastic out, if you could build a proper recycling system, reduce the amount of plastic, make sure you're recycling the rest of it, then waste to energy, which deals with predominantly biomass, is a step forward. But if you're burning tons of plastic and it just becomes a simple way to get rid of your landfill, then it doesn't have as much of an environmental benefit as it should.
Okay, if you were Prime Minister, Premier and local mayor for a day, what laws would you change to increase the momentum of the fight against against waste?
I would ban food going to landfill. I would change it so that I would bring in, at the moment there is one positive step policy at the moment, and that is the Australasian Recycling Label, which is a combination that APCO has been working with Planet Ark to make it so that on all of your plastic packaging, it tells you where it can be recycled. And it says it on the front, so you don't have to have a kind of chemical engineering degree to actually be able to recycle something at your bin. So I would make that compulsory, because in Australia, of course, we haven't made it compulsory. So some people are doing it, some aren't. But what that would mean is that everybody would know what can and can't be recycled. And then you could put more pressure on the people who are putting out packaging that isn't recyclable. I would also make it compulsory to use recycled content. And that's another area where I think there's a big investment opportunity. If you are, it's already been made compulsory in some European places. We have a, vague 30% recycled content target, but again, it's not being enforced. But if it was being enforced, it's going to be a lot of people looking for recycled content, and that's where that market is going to substantially.
Okay, there's a follow-up question along the same lines. In Germany, the shops must take back their packaging and old batteries. How can we or should we get our governments to introduce this?
Yeah, well, at the moment, the system we have is not government-run, so the red cycle system, which means that you can take all your plastic packaging and even your aluminium foil stuff and you can take it back to your Coles and Woolies. Now, positive about that is that there's that option there, and it's recycled in Australia through Reucassel, and it gets turned into new products. So that's great. The negative of that is that it's only people who can be bothered to put the recycling into a bag and drive it back to their Coles or Woolies that actually do it, and that means it's a small proportion. Some Melbourne councils have been testing where you can now put this soft plastics into your recycling bin as long as you put it together in a bag, and they say that's working, so you could possibly roll it out. I think there's a slight confusion after 30 years of yelling at the public saying, you don't put a plastic bag in your recycling bin, it ruins it. Suddenly say to them, hey, put all your plastic bags together in a plastic bag in your recycling bin. It's a difficult bit of messaging, but it would mean that you had a recycling route for that soft plastic that was in everyone's home, and that means you're going to get a higher take-up rate.
So we're heading towards a federal election, Craig. Presumably you're all over the policies of the two major parties, and given that we're, here quietly, Chatham House rules, no journos, what's your view on the policy positions of the major parties on the question of waste?
Well, it's interesting. It hasn't come out much. I know that Labor's been doing a bit of kind of behind-the-scenes investigation on waste, and I still haven't seen much come out. Whether it does come out, I'm not sure, but it'll be interesting to see what happens on that front. On the Liberal front, there's really been a total dropping of this. I mean, as I said, since the rare sightings of the Environment Minister became the case, there's been very little pushing on that front. The underlying policy is there, but there's no will to enforce it. There's no money put into it. There's just not requirement businesses to go through. So, yeah, there's a change when Labor comes in. At the moment, I haven't seen any evidence of that. I hope that will become the case.
So you've managed to make the boring topic of waste, although you obviously don't think it's boring, but you've managed to make the boring topic of waste for the rest of us engaging and mobilised a lot of Australians. And here's an interesting question. Do you have advice for us to mobilise people on super, the implication being it must be even more boring than waste?
Look, it would take. I'm interested in super, so I think it is a fascinating area.
Well said.
It's hard, and I think we've tried to do this over the years through the checkout as well. Getting people really to understand complex financial things is bloody hard, and we've tried to use humour over the years to do that, but it's still a difficult thing to do. I think it's interesting that super I would put in a similar category to climate change, in that what you've got is that it has a very big long-term influence on people, a long-term effect, and yet getting people to look long-term can be difficult. Now, we've seen a change coming around in climate change, and I guess the fact that there is massive threats to our way of life and that the climate is changing around people has probably changed that. So I'm not sure how you can show similar threats in the super system. It's a bit harder for you. Maybe if you, rob the pensioners of their money and show how bad the system would be otherwise, then, but, you don't have the big threats to show people. But I do think that through the Royal Commission there has been a much greater engagement with that. and I think people are thinking about it a lot more. So I think that the kinds of stories that I guess we did see through the Royal Commission of abuse have made it a bit more sexy, have made superannuation a bit more of a sexy topic. But I would have to sit down for a good month with a notebook to figure out how to do the war on super show, I think.
I look forward to the expensive proposal that you're obviously going to bowl up. So just a couple more questions before we finish. You had some great stunts on the show. My memory is the tram full of rubbish going through Melbourne, and the snowball of garbage, I think, rolling down Malcolm Turnbull Street, if I remember it. Now, given it's the Chaser, you must have done some really crazy, stupid things that went terribly wrong and ended up on the cutting room floor. So can you tell us what they were?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, this wasn't a Chaser show, and so the one stunt with the tram was actually based on the English War on Waste, where they did it with a bus there. So I've got to give credit to them actually for coming up with that idea initially. Although the chasing people around with plastic bags was very much our idea. And I tell you, the one thing that was worrying about that is that when you're got a giant ball with plastic bags and you're rolling it around, and your whole message is we don't want plastic waste, it means you're extremely aware of the fact that you can't let any of those plastic things come over. And one day we were filming in Canberra in an enormous wind, and the ball got picked up by the wind and was going towards Lake Burley Griffin. And I knew that if that went in Lake Burley Griffin in the middle of winter, I was going in after it, because otherwise this show was its reputation was trashed beyond belief. So I caught it just before it got to the edge. But I did realise that chasing politicians with a giant ball is a very ineffective way of doing it. So when we went to try and chase Daniel Andrews, hiding with a big ball made out of plastic is very hard, and the federal police were onto us very quickly, and he managed to sneak in a back door. Mm-hmm. So in future I might take a slightly smaller prop when I'm chasing politicians, so that they don't twig that I'm there.
And so finally, it's a war that you've started, right? So how will you know when you've won?
Yeah, this could be the 100-year war, I think. There seems to be the occasional step forward and then an occasional step backwards as well. So when there is no more litter or waste, and everything we use, we reuse, we recycle, or we compost, and, I take my coffee cup and maybe I eat it at the end or something like that, then I will know I've won, and when it's all carbon neutral as well. I feel like, given the current position we're in and the current level of leadership from politicians around Australia, this may be a long war. I definitely don't feel like armistice is close.
Okay, so that brings us to the end of our time. Craig, thanks for persevering, although again...
Well, thank you for persevering.
Yeah, well, if you had to take my advice about the petrol money in the first place. So look, the gift, speaker gift, Craig, is a donation to the First Nations Foundation on your behalf. And again, thanks for your time today. Can everyone please join me in thanking Craig Reucassel? See you.
Thank you.